That the government have been promoting recently with various schemes. So what is advanced materials? Well, I'm from the Department of Materials, and what we do is try and understand materials right from the atomic level through the nanoscale, through the macro to their properties for a particular application. So we need to understand how materials behave right from really tiny scale right through to the macro scale with respect to the application. Now, the application I'm most interested in is in regenerative medicine. So what that means is the materials, we need to understand how they tell cells to do things. And we want to design these materials to tell cells to do things that we want them to do, and of course not what we don't want them to do, because that can be bad. So regenerative medicine is the idea of helping the body heal itself by some means. That can be with drugs. But what I want to talk to you about today is how we can design materials to do the same sort of things that drugs can do, but without the actual drugs. So one thing we're trying to do is move towards less reliance on conventional pharmaceutical industry. Apologies to anyone who works in that area here. So I'm going to start by also sort of telling you, not just enthusing you about material science, hopefully, but about one of my favorite materials, as you might have heard in the introduction, which is glass. Now, not many people realize that glass is actually a really high-tech material. Now, why is that? We normally think of glass as being all around us. We can see through it. We quite often take that for granted, that we can see through it. So why is it high-tech? We normally think of it as being quite attractive, like that Chihuly piece up on the left there. But now, all our buildings are being covered in glass. One reason is because it looks quite nice, at least I think it does. But the other reason is that it's a high-tech material. So that middle picture there is of the Shard down in London Bridge, the tallest building in Europe. And they covered it in glass. They wouldn't have done that a few years ago. They wouldn't have done it many years ago because they weren't able to make large pieces of glass. So if you look around here, if you look across at Westminster Abbey, all the windows are tiny pieces of glass. And that's because that's all they could make at the time. So now, of course, they can make these huge panes of glass. And that's due to a material science evolution in the UK, where at Pilkington they developed the float glass process, where they can make these huge pieces of flat glass. But now, of course, they did that a few years ago. Now, it's not just about making a large, flat piece of glass. It's about making it strong enough to be really big. But it's also about added functionality. Now, you see those people abseiling down the shaft. That was when it first opened, and the first time they cleaned it. They haven't had to do that since. And that's because the windows are self-cleaning. That doesn't mean lots of robots come out and do abseiling. It means that the surface of the glass is such that things don't stick to it, so they don't get dirty, at least not as dirty as normal windows. And I'm sure many of you have smartphones. I'm sure many of you have an iPhone. And since iPhone 4, the cover sheet, the screen has always been glass. And that's because it's high strength and scratch resistant. And it feels nice. It feels nicer touching a piece of glass than it does polycarbonate.
Still breaks.
Still breaks. Depends what you do to it, I suppose. Right, so, and then this thing down here. I don't know how many people can know what that is. But that blue thing on there is an aerogel. And an aerogel, some people call it solid sky, or well, because it's a little bit blue. It's only a little bit blue because of the way the light diffracts through it. And until recently, that was undisputedly the lightest material known to man. It was 99.9% air. Now, some people disagree that it's the lightest material, with things like graphene around and things like that. So it's almost, or some people say it still is the lightest. So this sort of blue smoke type thing is it is a solid material, and it is a glass. And it was designed by NASA, and they used it to capture meteorites in space. So this would stick it on the side of their spacecraft, and asteroids or meteorites would fly into it, and because it's so porous, it would slow them down and capture them. And because it's also an insulating material, when it returned to Earth through the atmosphere, it didn't burn up, and people could pick out the asteroids. In fact, you can go online and help them with their studies of tiny little asteroids that are being found. There's so many they can't analyze them enough under their microscopes. Now, underneath that, there's a little foam, and that's a glass foam, and that's kind of a sister material to aerogel. And that's one of the scaffolds that we've been developing at Imperial College for regenerative medicine. So I'll tell you about how we get back to that later on. So this is Imperial College. I'm sure you've heard about it from Professor Gast earlier. But it's in a nice part of London. So where does materials fit into Imperial College? Well, it fits in the middle, of course, centre of Imperial College, the focus of all attention. Also, this was made by Professor Alford, who's head of Department of Biomaterials, of Materials. Oops, that was a slip of the tongue. So materials science fits in the middle. But that's not just because we like it so much. It's because it's a very multidisciplinary area. So physics is very important, chemistry is very important. And of course, for me, biology is very important. So that's why it fits in with the others. So what else do we have in Imperial? Well, materials sits in the Faculty of Engineering. And the other things in engineering, things like the bioengineering, and the conventional engineering is like chemical, electrical, and mechanical. There's also the Faculty of Life Science, which has the pure sciences like chemistry and physics. There's a business school. And there's also the Faculty of Medicine, which is also very important to me. And the Faculty of Medicine is also the same size as the rest of the college put together. So materials is cited there because we actually work with people from most of those other departments. Within the Department of Materials, we have different research themes. Of course, the most important one is biomaterials and tissue engineering, but also things like functional materials, engineering alloys, ceramics and glasses, nanotechnology, and atomic scale simulation. And those are the real strengths of our department. So application areas we're really interested in: medicine, energy, functional materials, and things like solar cells, things like that. So because materials are so multidisciplinary, we also have lots of research centres that are college-wide that we have, some of them we run and some of them we have huge input into. So to pick out a few: composites, modelling centres at Thomas Young Centre, Centre for Advanced Structural Ceramics, and of course Institute of Biomedical Engineering. Our department has grown very much over the last 3 years. When I started, when I was first appointed to faculty just over 10 years ago, we only had about 18 academic staff. So now we have 38. So it's a thriving department. And the average age of the academic staff, the faculty, is actually younger than me. And I'm 37. So it's a very young and vibrant department. Of course, you may have heard Imperial College doing very well at the moment. There's all sorts of ranking tables, so I've just taken a couple. On the left here we have QS World Rankings. So Imperial College was ranked second in the world, just behind MIT. And if we look at material science, just a little bit lower, at fourth. So we're really pleased with that. But one we're actually more pleased with is the one done in Shanghai, which is, of course this table was actually done in the UK. This one's done in Shanghai, and we're the only non-American university in the top 10. So we're actually even more excited by coming 8th in that one. So in terms of biomaterials, we have lots of talented faculty and lots of talented students and postdocs. And these are the people working in the area of biomaterials. So back to what I was going to talk about in terms of the science. So I was telling you glass is one of my favourite materials. And here's another Chihuly piece of art that's this huge sculpture that's actually hanging in the entrance hall of the V&A Museum in South Kensington, just by Imperial College. So if you're passing by, just wander in the entrance hall and look up, and you'll see this spectacular piece of glasswork. It may not be to everyone's taste, but the sheer skill in making it is quite amazing. Why does it look so nice and attractive to the eye? Because glass has this optical transparency that we're so familiar with. But that's not why glass is not so important maybe for its aesthetics, but here on the other side is the humble test tube. Now, of course, many of you have worked with test tubes at some time in your school or university life. I'm wondering whether you realize about the sort of material science expertise that had to go into that and the amazing properties of glass that made it useful. So, of course, when you use a test tube, you're using chemicals in it, and you're using it over a fire, usually. But the most important property is the fact that you can see through it. Before you could see through the glass, people were doing chemistry in ceramics and crucibles that you couldn't see what was going on. So they were having to peer through the smoke and fumes. Not very health and safety conscious. So just having a glass tube allows you to see through it and see what the chemical reactions are happening. So it revolutionized chemistry. And of course, this optical property has been used over the years and tailored for all sorts of applications. So, of course, microscopes. So the first contribution glass had to biology and medicine was being able to see cells through a microscope. Before that, we couldn't see them. And now, of course, we have these techniques for keyhole surgery, where the arthroscopy, you use these optical fibers that you can enter low in your body, and they can do brain surgery on you by weaving this piece of equipment through your body, through your blood vessels. And of course, we can see things distant in space because we have things like the Hubble telescope. And anyone who uses high-speed broadband is probably using optical fibers for that too. So what is a glass? Why can we see through it? Well, glass is usually, when it's made of silica, which most glasses are, it's made up of an arrangement of silica where you've got a silicon in the middle and these oxygens around it, and they're arranged in this tetrahedron structure. And these tetrahedra are all joined together in a random way. That gives an amorphous structure. It's a randomized structure. And that's one of the main reasons we can see through glass. But it's not just because it's amorphous. It's because when visible light passes through it, the electrons in the glass aren't given enough energy to kick up into the next energy level. But when ultraviolet light comes in, it does give the electrons enough energy, so they do go up, and the energy is absorbed. So I think that's, on its own, pretty high tech. The fact that we can drive around in our cars and not get sunburn is pretty useful. And that property obviously existed back in Roman times. But it's all down to quantum mechanics. So another aspect of glass being high-tech. So if you look at the atomic structure of glass and look at the atomic simulation that people like the guys in our Theory and Simulation Center can do, then this is what glass looks like. What I want you to take away from that is just it's a bit of a mess. And that's the amorphous structure. And that's really important for the applications I'm going to tell you about today. This amorphous structure is critical for delivery of, or the way it dissolves, and the way it delivers ions that have a beneficial effect. And it's also critical as to why Corning's Gorilla Glass was so successful for the iPhone. Now, the way they get this glass so strong, although not strong enough, and scratch resistant, is that they actually play around with the atoms at the surface and just below the surface. And by changing some of those atoms, substituting them, the surface goes under compression and it is higher strength, tougher, and scratch resistant. Now, the most recent iPhone has Gorilla Glass 3. I'm not sure how many tests that's been through yet of people dropping it. So on to regenerative medicine. And where does glass fit into regenerative medicine? First, why do we need regenerative medicine? Well, the first reason is life expectancy is really increasing and our population is aging. So why is it doing that? A lot of people think due to better healthcare. But the biggest contributor is actually cleaner water. So healthcare is actually lagging behind other reasons for life expectancy increasing. So what we need to do now is make sure the quality of life is good. So some people talk about 50 high-quality years after 50. That's the sort of thing we're concentrating on. So we have this, and so in the Sunday Times in 1999, there was a headline that said, "There's a surgical revolution, and tissue engineering is coming. We'll be able to regrow body parts in 10 years." 10 years later, there was a headline in the national newspaper. "Doctors, we can keep you young. In 10 years, we'll be able to regrow body parts." That was 2009. Now we're 2015, halfway to the next 10 years. We still really haven't done it yet. The message behind that is, of course, whenever no one really knows how long it's going to take, they say 10 years. But one thing we have to deal with in my area of research and development is that, of course, when we design something, we have to get it approved for use. Now, the dilemma is, do you start designing something that you know will be approved, but might not be any good, or do you design things for purpose? And in that case, you need to design things from the bottom up, from scratch. But then you've got more effort to get them approved. That's the kind of dilemma that people in my field have to work with. My philosophy, personally, is we've been playing around for a long time. We keep seeing these headlines, in 10 years, in 10 years. And that's largely because we've been using materials that exist. So, for example, hip replacements are made with aerospace alloys. Those alloys weren't designed for purpose. So it's about time. We've had all these 25 years of this area of tissue engineering. It's time that we actually design materials for purpose. And that's where the advanced materials comes in, and innovation in material science. So an example of where these things are needed is in bone regeneration. Now this is a typical sort of badly broken bones. And of course, bones normally heal themselves if you've got a hairline fracture. You can put the bones back together, put a cast around it, and they will heal. But when they're not quite able, when surgeons aren't able to knit them back together, they won't heal. So what they have to do is take bone from other parts of the body or use synthetic materials. Now, the ideal situation for a surgeon is that they can take something off the shelf and they can implant it directly, and it will behave just like natural tissue. Now, to do that, it needs to have this, we need to fulfill all the engineering criteria. So it starts off being an engineering problem. You need to have a three-dimensional template or a scaffold for tissue growth. For that, the pores need to be open. You need a porous, open structure. The idea being that when this is implanted, the blood will flow in, cells will penetrate, they'll attach to the sides of the scaffold, and then they will be told by something to lay down new tissue. Then over time, the scaffold should gradually disappear as the new tissue is healing. So how do we get that to happen? Well, we need it to be biodegradable. That means we need it to break down and the degradation products to be friendly. If we need to tell the cells what to do, then signals need to be released. Now, in this sort of environment, the ideal situation is that this material will also share load with the host bone. Why? Because if you don't load your bones, you'll never get healthy healing. Astronauts in space, they have to exercise like crazy because if they don't load their bones, they'll start wasting away. And the same thing happens if you don't load your bones after these sort of defects. So that's the idea of in situ regeneration, where you're putting the material into the body immediately, and then it does everything inside the body. Another strategy is tissue engineering, where you have the material, and you take cells, maybe from the bone marrow of the patient, and you grow them on the material in the lab. And then you decide, are you going to implant the material in the tissue, or are you going to grow tissue completely in the lab, get rid of the material, and implant tissue only? And that's been reasonably successful with skin. You can grow sheets of skin in the lab, and you can put them on someone as a skin graft without any material being present. You may have heard in the press about the trachea, which is between the lungs. They were able to create a scaffold that could heal a trachea. But apart from that, there's not really much progress in terms of clinical use of these things. And why is that? Well, because it's not quite as easy as people may think. So this is tissue engineering made easy. Here's my friend Wesley in his lab, and he's got some cells, and he's put them on his scaffold, and he's putting them in the incubator. He's waiting, and out comes the bone. Now that's the ideality of tissue engineering. The reality, of course, is very difficult to grow, one, that amount of tissue, but also getting that right morphology of tissue. The bone is a very complicated tissue with all sorts of different aspects. For example, in order to get something looking like that, you would need to have it under the natural loading environment that the body has. And when you talk to clinicians, they give you all sorts of ideas about what they would like. They want something that's a porous template, but is also a putty, and also takes the load of a natural bone. But it also should be injectable. So yeah, we have to work with clinicians in a two-way street. One, to hear what they want, and also to tell them what they can actually expect. So in my research group, we work with scaffolds for regenerative medicine, particularly building them from the bottom up. So from chemistry synthesis through processing to the scaffold. And we're also interested in how we can release things, ions from these materials that can act like drugs and stimulate tissue repair. And those two things together, strangely, can lead to new toothpaste. And I'll come to that in a moment. So when you see some of the research from that I'll be showing, a lot of this will be, because it's all done by my research group, two pictures because they never seem to be in the same place at one time. So where does glass fit into regenerative medicine? Well, it started back with my old boss, Professor Larry Hench, who you see in the picture. And he invented a material called bioglass. Now, this is a glass that, when you implant it into the body, it starts reacting. It starts dissolving. It's quite similar to window glass in some respects, except that it's got much lower silica, which means it actually starts degrading and dissolving in the body, quite safely. And what it does, it forms quite a fast bond to bone. So it bonds quicker to bone than any other material. It's a chemical bond. But the extra special thing it does, it doesn't just stick to bone, it actually tells bone cells to produce more bone. And it does that by releasing soluble silica and calcium ions. And they get released out and they tell the cells what to do, without telling other cells to do bad things. So that's the good thing about bioglass. So why isn't it everywhere in surgery? Well, it's probably because it's only commercially available as a powder. So it doesn't have that three-dimensional structure I was telling you about that surgeons crave for tissue engineering or bone regeneration. But when you compare it to the other materials that are currently available, it performs much better. So this is synthetic hydroxyapatite, and this is bioglass in the same clinical study. So it clearly stimulates more bone growth than similar materials. And the product, NovaBone, has been used in 1 million patients. Sounds quite a lot, except that it's, bioglass was invented originally in 1970. So it took 24 years to get to the clinic. That's the aspect of regulatory approval and commercialization. And since then, it's been used in 1 million patients, but in this powder form. And they could see it was being better than all the other bioactive ceramics that exist. And the reason for that was its ions that are being released, and they're actually stimulating the genes in bone cells to produce new bone. And that was work that was carried out at Imperial College by Larry Hench and his collaborator Dame Julia Polak. And they did these studies in the Tissue Engineering Centre at Imperial, really finding out why it was better. And that kind of led to this idea of these ions being released and these ions having a stimulatory role. Actually led to the idea that it's not just about having a solid material there, it's about what these ions can do. So later on I'll be telling you about ions that can do other things, not just stimulate bone growth. But in the meantime, they took this idea and actually developed a toothpaste containing bioglass. So anyone who has sensitive teeth, many people use the brand Sensodyne. But the original Sensodyne just had an anesthetic. So why do people have sensitive teeth? Because the dentin underneath the enamel is exposed, and dentin has little tubules that run into the nerve cavity inside the tooth. So brush your teeth with anesthetic, you don't feel the pain anymore. But this particular toothpaste, Repair and Protect, contains small amounts of bioglass. Doesn't say on the packet because the general person on the street probably doesn't want to read they're brushing their teeth with glass. And of course it's a special type of glass that dissolves quite fast. So it's a lot softer than window glass. So how does it work? Well, because when you brush your teeth, you're in this sort of in the environment of your saliva, the glass particles dissolve and they deposit calcium phosphate on the teeth, which becomes mineral, natural mineral, like the dentin, like the enamel. So it seals up those tubules with natural tooth mineral. But it's the role of the ions that's doing that, not the actual particles. It's not the particles themselves blocking the holes. So that's quite important. Now, there are two ways of making glass. The traditional way is by melting everything together in a crucible and pouring it out one way or another. But the other way, which I'm actually more interested in, is the sol gel process. And this is similar to the process that made that aerogel I was telling you about earlier on. Now, the sol gel process is a chemistry-based process. You start with a solution, the sol, and then it will form a gel, hence the sol gel process. Now, I was saying before that bioglass is only commercially available as a powder. And that's largely because that composition that has approval for use, the composition is such that when you try and fuse it together, as you would need to do to make something like this, when you sinter it, it actually crystallizes and starts becoming a ceramic. So it goes from the amorphous, glassy structure to a ceramic. And that actually makes it lose its bioactive properties. So back in my PhD, we developed the first porous bioglass scaffolds that stayed amorphous by using a completely different approach, which was sol gel. And by doing that, we were able to get porous scaffolds like this that look quite a bit like porous bone. They have that porous structure. They have good strength and compression. They're bioactive. And they're made by the sol gel process. So the sol gel process works by having a precursor, reacting it with water, and you start forming nanoparticles that are floating around in solution. And of course, they're so small you don't see them. It still looks like water, but there's these nanoparticles floating around. And then if you have an acid catalyst, these particles start assembling together. And they start building the glassy network. And eventually you'll go from this water-like solution and become more viscous, and eventually it'll become a gel, a wet gel. And then you can dry it and heat it, and you'll end up with a glass. But the special thing about this glass compared to the conventional glass is this glass is nanoporous. Because these nanoparticles come together and assemble, it leaves little tiny pores between them. And that is extremely beneficial when it comes to cells attaching to the surface. They love a rough surface. They don't like a smooth surface. And by using this, the property that, or the behavior that this solution went to a gel, you can add a simple step in that process, which is a foaming process. And that creates these bubbles, which then become pores. And you can create these porous scaffolds that look like porous bone. And you can put, and then, so once we create a new product, we then need to see how it's going to perform. And the first step is seeing how cells perform on the surface. And what we saw is that bone cells love the surface, they populate the surface, and they lay down new bone tissue. And the way it does that is unique to biactive glass. The other biactive ceramics need additional growth factors added in. And then we can look at the cells that take bone away. These are osteoclasts. And what we see when we put them on the surface and take them away, we see these pits on the surface. Why is that interesting? Well, that's useful because we want these things to degrade, but also be taken over by natural bone. And this is the natural process that happens in the body. One type of cell, the osteoblast, lays down bone. The other cells, osteoclasts, take bone away, and it's a continual remodeling. And then when we look at this, these scaffolds in a rat, we start to see, these are X-ray images. This is the defect. This is a 3D view from images taken at Harwell, which is next to Diamond, our synchrotron source. So if anyone needs 3D imaging, I do recommend you head out to Diamond at some point. This is a side view of the tibia, which is like a tube. And this was where the hole was. The scaffold goes in, and then the bone grew through it. The important thing is the bone grows through it in its natural form without deviating or going anywhere else. But also that the scaffold itself is also disappearing over time. And we're also now able to 3D print these things. So what I showed you just now were these porous foam scaffolds that look a bit like porous bone. But whether that structure is really ideal for stimulating bone growth, I'm not so sure. Surgeons like it because it looks like natural bone. But by 3D printing, you can design the scaffold that is best for what you think is actually best for bone regeneration. So what's the problem with these scaffolds? They do everything we want them to do in terms of they'll go into a bone defect, they'll regenerate it. They send out these ions that tell cells to do what we want them to do. They biodegrade quite in a nice way. But what they don't do is take cyclic load. They're brittle, they're glasses. They're stiff and they're brittle. So that means if you think back to that example of the broken bones, you can't really apply load through these materials because they'll shatter. So we need things that can share load and be more flexible and match the mechanical properties of bone and hopefully cartilage. Now one way you can do that is make things flexible. Now this is an example, make things thinner. So glass actually becomes flexible when it's a thin fibre. And some results in the US have shown that these critical ulcers found in some diabetic patients, these are critical ulcers that weren't healing. When they put some of this glass in, they did. And that's actually, the serious is actually saving amputations. What we've actually managed to do is be able to fire lasers at some of these glasses and spin out nanofibers in this cotton wool-like structure. And we can electrospin the sol gel. So the beauty of sol gel is going from the solution to gel, is that that transition can be used in electrospinning, and you can create these cotton wool-like glasses. So these are flexible, have great potential in wound healing, and also for fitting into any old bone defects that are irregular shapes. But they're never going to take load. So the obvious way to make something that will take load is to make a conventional composite. And the way of doing that is taking things like the biactive glass particles and embedding them in a polymer matrix. So why doesn't that really work very well in biomaterials? Well, the main reason is if you then put a cell on top of this material, it's only going to see those particles that are poking through the surface. So it's quite difficult to actually control that and make sure that happens. And then there's the polymer. What polymer do you use? Most approved biodegradable polymers degrade too fast. So we actually need to redesign the polymers as well. So the way we've been working on these problems is creating things called sol gel hybrid materials. Now, a hybrid is different from a composite because of the relationship between the two components. A composite is two things added together, and you can see the two materials in the material. A hybrid is such that the chains, or the chains of the organic and the chains of the inorganic are intimately intertwined, and it's called a co-network. That means that above the nanoscale, you can't see that there's two materials there. That's beneficial for three reasons. It should degrade as one material rather than two things added together. When the cells come along to the surface, they shouldn't notice that there's two materials. And in terms of controlling the mechanical properties and biodegradation, it must be the most accurate way of doing it because of this intimate relationship. So we're looking at chains of polymers, the silica network, and how we bond them together to get enhanced mechanical properties. The way this is done is because this sol-gel process actually starts at room temperature, and you're creating this sol to gel transition, you can introduce the polymer right at the early stage. And the polymer will interrupt the sol-gel process and really get in between the silica network. So it's quite easy to create porous scaffolds in this way. But there are many challenges. And the first one is, what polymer do we actually use? It would be nice to use collagen because that's what's in our natural tissues. But how do we get hold of collagen? Where is it going to come from? We can't yet synthesize it in enough quantity to be useful. So what we can take is something that can be synthesized, like polygamma-glutamic acid. So collagen is actually chains of amino acids. And you can separate it out, and one chain would be gelatin. And then you can simplify it even more and saying one of these amino acid units is glutamic acid. So let's use polygamma-glutamic acid. Other polymers of interest: alginate is a polysaccharide extracted from seaweed, and chitosan is a polysaccharide extracted from crustacean shells. The common thing between all these materials, all these polymers, is that they have these functional groups on the surface. So this is really important. And also important, they can actually degrade by enzyme activity inside the body. And if we allow our enzymes that are naturally there to degrade materials like they would normally, then the degradation rate should match that of the host tissue. So to illustrate what happens when you just make one of these scaffolds by adding the two things together, in this high-tech degradation study, you can see that the thing dissolves like sugar. So what we need to do is actually have covalent bonding between the organic and the inorganic component. And we can do that by little molecules called coupling agents, where we have these things like this, where this end will bond to the polymer and this end bonds into the silica network. And you can see that these little things will anchor the two components together. And then when we do our high-tech degradation study, when we've done that, we see it doesn't degrade like sugar. So just to re-illustrate, polymer chain, functional group, coupling agent into the silica network. So there's quite a lot of chemistry in getting this to work properly and understanding how this nanoscale structure fits together. And because of this, we can change the amount of polymer, we can change the amount of coupling agent, and we can tailor our mechanical properties and our degradation rate. And because of this sol-gel process, where we're going from solution to gel, we can also 3D print it. So imagine we've got this viscous sol in a nozzle being printed, as we saw in the movie earlier. And by using a polymer called polycaprolactone, we can functionalize it and use this coupling agent. And we've actually got this property that we've been looking for 10 years, where we actually have something that has this real elasticity and mechanical strength. So if you take this and bounced it, it would bounce like one of those kids' power balls, bounces around your desk quite nicely. And just to illustrate that, another high-tech mechanical property study. These are two hybrid scaffolds The one on the right is stiffer because it's got more silica. The one on the left is more elastic because it's got more polymer. So one bounces, the other one doesn't. So finally, I just wanted to say that I started talking about these silica and calcium ions that stimulate bone cells. But this amorphous structure of the glass that makes it unique and makes it dissolve also enables you to incorporate all sorts of other cations in the glass. So you can take the glass and use it effectively as a drug delivery device, except you're not delivering drugs in a conventional sense. You can deliver these ions. So some ions that are known to have properties are silver, which is antimicrobial, antibacterial. Strontium ions behave a bit like calcium, except that they can actually be useful in osteoporosis. Why? Because they keep the bone cells going, but they also stop the cells that take away the bone, stop the osteoclasts. Cobalt has a strange property in that it can trick the body in thinking that there's no oxygen there. And that kicks the body into thinking, right, we need to make more blood vessels. So you get enhanced angiogenesis. Lithium. Lithium has just been recently found that it might actually stimulate cartilage repair. How did people know? Because a lot of people taking antidepressants, which was lithium, their knees got better. So we can actually incorporate these into the glass and release them at a sustained rate in the site. So how might we actually use these? Well, we can make nanoparticles. And this is another beauty of the sol-gel process, where you go from solution to gel. If you change the conditions, you can, instead of making these scaffolds, you can actually make nanoparticles. More importantly, you can make nanoparticles of controlled size and keep them as nanoparticles. And each of these particles could contain some of these therapeutic ions. The other useful thing about these nanoparticles is that cells actually take them up. So if you give a cell these nanoparticles, they'll sort of open their doors and bring the nanoparticles into the cell without changing the behavior of the cell inherently until these ions start being released. The other slightly strange thing is these particles actually degrade faster inside the cells than they do outside. Again, beneficial if you want to deliver these ions inside the cells. So in summary, bioactive glasses and hybrid scaffolds can be produced by these foaming, spinning, and 3D printing processes using this sol-gel technology. By making a hybrid, you can tailor your degradation rate and mechanical properties while keeping all the biological benefits of the glass. But what we do need, now we've got these high-tech glass-based materials, we actually need more high-tech polymers for purpose as well. So if any of this interested you, then there's a review on most of the stuff I've talked about in Active Biomaterialia. And we've written this book called Bioglasses: An Introduction. I wanted to call it Bioglasses for Dummies to illustrate the fact that it's written in a sort of accessible way that people who aren't in the field can enjoy it. But they wouldn't let me, even though they own the rights to the name as well. Very disappointing. So again, thanks to the group who've been generating all these new materials. And I better tell the people who've paid for it. And I hope this illustrates actually I was talking about the multidisciplinarity of materials science and biomaterials. What you may notice is that the funding bodies are not just from one place, they come from all walks of life. And thank you all for listening.